So the final question regarding interest groups was asked, if lobbyists and interest groups only represent the middle upper class population, who actually represents the lower class? And I think this is a fascinating, wonderful question to ask, particularly considering the issues of economic inequality currently confronting the United States. And I think, what we need to recognize is one of the central questions that political scientists who study interest groups want to understand is, why do interest group politics have such a pronounced upper class bias? Meaning, interest groups tend to come from the wealthy, they tend to come from those with rich economic resources. And so those resource-rich groups, the individuals and the groups that have access to economic resources, find it easier to mobilize and to focus on their particular issue, perhaps one issue in particular. They have the opportunity to engage oftentimes in both direct and indirect lobbying. And I would encourage you, if you don't know what those terms are, to make sure that you do know what those terms are from the textbook, as well as be able to provide the incentives for members and to members to join the group. Remember that strength in number and offering opportunities, particularly material incentives or perhaps purposive incentives, really does come easier based on the resource richness that interest groups may have. Now, since interest groups are mostly made up of middle and upper class people, are the opinions of lower class people ever really heard when the group is discussing issues and policies? And this was another question. I found it interesting that a couple of students basically were asking the same kind of question. And I think what you can recognize in terms of interest groups that focus on lower class citizens can kind of be grouped into a certain few types of interest groups. Certainly labor unions. Over the history of the United States, particularly with the advent of industrialization in the late 1800s through the early 1900s and into the 20th century, labor unions played a crucial role in representing the needs and concerns of lower class citizens. You also have public interest groups, those public interest groups that form with a sense of, we're not advocating for one specific issue, we're advocating for a wide variety of issues that benefit the common good, that benefit the collective, that benefit everyone, particularly those in lower class economic situations. And then also the rise of nonprofit organizations. They can be very instrumental in trying to get the issues, get the policies, get the concerns of lower class citizens recognized in front of government policymakers and decision makers. Now, this kind of brings me to some research done by a political scientist, Martin Gilens, and his research that he published in a book called Affluence and Influence: Economic Inequality and Political Power in America. And what he did was he looked at the different types of groups and who they tended to advocate most for in their interest group lobbying activities. And there was a chart developed from the book that showed the different types of groups and how their positions tended to reflect either a middle class interest or conflict with middle class interest. And you see these unions were among the only interest groups whose positions lined up with the interests of middle class. So the United Automobile Workers, the National Education Association, the AFL-CIO, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. Those labor unions tended to reflect the most in terms of their positions with the middle class interests. Interestingly enough, universities, AARP, and the National Governors Association, the NGA, also represented and reflected the interest of the middle class. Notice the positions that conflict with middle class interests and how you work down the line from the National Rifle Association to the National Restaurant Association to defense contractors, all the way down to oil companies. And this final slide, I want to kind of give the sense of, out of his research, what he was able to find in terms of advocacy for lower class, the low class of society. And he argues that AARP, the universities, the National Governors Associations, and unions advocate for policies the poor support, while most prominent interest groups, particularly those representing business, tended to work against the preferences of the poor. Now, what was interesting was that most unions, along with AARP, the universities, and the NGA, tended to support policy measures favored by those at the highest end, those with incomes at the 90th percentile. And so what he was arguing is that these unions, AARP, the NGA, universities, tend to support policy measures that most Americans want, whether it's lower class, middle class, or upper class, while most interest groups, particularly those represented by business owners, tended to represent the views of a very narrow constituency, those that tend to sing with an upper class bias.